generating all this spending. And because our economy is stronger than, let's say, the Japanese economy or the European economy or the Chinese economy, we're running a trade deficit. Our economy is so strong, we're spending so much more than everybody else. Of course, that is pure nonsense. We don't have a trade deficit because we have a strong economy. We have a trade deficit because we have a weak economy. You know, once upon a time, America had the strongest economy in the world, and we had the biggest trade surpluses in the world at the same time. You see, when your economy is strong, you produce a lot of stuff. You produce more stuff than you need, and you export the surplus. So strong economies are productive economies. They produce excess stuff, more than they need. See, we're trying to redefine strength as spending. Spending money is not a sign of strength. In fact, it could be a sign of weakness if you're borrowing that money, which is exactly what we're doing. You know, other countries are saving while we're going into debt. Those are the strong economies, not America. It's the countries that are operating with trade surpluses, that produce more than they consume. Those are the strong economies. It's a weak economy that consumes more than it produces. It's an economy that is made up of people who are living beyond their means. Is that what you do when you're strong? Do you live beyond your means? No. When you're strong, you have so much means that you can live beneath them, that you can accumulate savings. That's how you accumulate wealth. So even when they report on the trade deficit, they misreport. They don't understand it. And again, I think it's because so many people are of the mindset that America has a strong economy, that they take this weak economic data and they somehow try to sugarcoat it, or their mind just can't comprehend that it's evidence of weakness. So people take this weak economic data and they spin it as if it was strong. And a lot of people just, oh yeah, sure, we have a strong economy, so we go out and spend. Right? These other countries, they don't have all that economic strength, so they can't spend so much. And maybe superficially, if you don't really have much of an understanding of economics, you know, you could buy this. And unfortunately, most of the people who are economists in this country, who teach economics or who are professionals that work for the government or the Federal Reserve, they don't understand anything about economics either. So they might think that these trade deficits are a reflection of how strong our economy is, but the reality is it's the reverse. But what's more significant right now about the trade deficits is that it has to be financed. And we have $2 trillion budget deficits. Nobody talks about the twin deficits anymore. They were a huge problem in the 1980s. Everybody talked about the twin deficits back then because we were running trade surplus, trade deficits, and budget deficits. And they were a problem. They were a big problem for the bond market. They were a big problem for the dollar. And they became a big problem for the stock market. In fact, the trade deficits and the impact it had on the dollar and the bond market is probably the real reason that we had the stock market crash in 1987. But today, nobody cares about either of these deficits, even though they're both much bigger now than they were back then. Well, nobody cares until they care. And I think soon people are going to start paying attention to these numbers. And again, what I think we saw in the markets this week, and especially on Friday, given the failure of the bond market to rally on a weak jobs number, right? Given the fact that the dollar and the bond market decoupled, where the dollar sold off and bonds sold off, or coupled, because they had been trading opposite, right? Because they were all trading rate. The currency traders were looking at strong economic data, which was bad for bonds. They were buying the dollar. So even though they were selling treasuries, they were buying dollars. Now they're selling treasuries and dollars at the same time. that is a very bad sign for the U.S. economy and for the financial markets. And again, gold went up and oil went up. And oil went up, a couple of bucks, but on a chart, we've now taken out some resistance. There was, oil was trading below 70 for a while, and now it's kind of broken out. And so it looks like there's a lot of room to go up. And if oil prices are going to rise, a lot of other commodity prices are going to rise too. And the main reason that we got the break in the headline CPI was energy prices and other commodity prices that came down. If they're now going up, if oil has bottomed and we're going up from here, that's going to start to put the upward pressure on these official inflation numbers. And remember, the whole time headline inflation was coming down, the core wasn't. I mean, the core numbers still stayed in the high fours, low fives. Never got anywhere near 2%. Because again, remember, the Fed is more focused on the core, not the headline numbers. And so we got more relief in the headline numbers than the core. But now the headline numbers are going to turn higher. And the core never really went down. And now that's going to turn higher. So this is a huge problem, because if the markets recognize that inflation is here to stay, that is a whole new ball game for gold and the dollar. And I think this is a great time, to be buying here. Gold is not breaking 1900. I mean, it closed the week around 1925. I really haven't seen it trade below 1900. So it's in a very narrow range. Yes, it didn't hold 2000. And so a lot of people got bearish on gold because it didn't hold 2000. So what? It's holding 1900. Gold is holding up despite the fact that everybody is optimistic on the economy, optimistic on tech, optimistic that the Fed has gotten the inflation genie back in the bottle. There's all sorts of optimism out there and very little interest in the price of gold or buying gold. And despite all that, gold hasn't gone down. And I think it's holding up a lot better than people give it credit for. And we're getting ready for a big move up. So I think, this is a good time to be buying at this price. I don't think you're going to get much lower prices. If you're trying to wait for a low price, I think you're pretty much in the neighborhood of the bottom. And so this is where you should be buying your gold, more, even your silver, even more so. I see more upside in silver than gold, but I see upside in both of those metals. So again, you want to contact Schiff Gold and buy some physical gold and silver. For those of you who are risk takers, right? If you want to try to make 5 or 10 times your money or maybe more, the way to do that is not in physical gold, but in the mining stocks. If the price of gold does what I think it's going to do, then we're going to have an explosive rally in these mining stocks. And nobody is buying these stocks. I mean, the sentiment is very negative in the sector. People are still chasing the tech names or now the AI names, but nobody is paying attention to the real inflation trade. Nobody is buying the senior miners, let alone these junior miners. That's what you should be doing. Right? You need to be looking at where the big money is ignoring. Right? That's how you end up making a lot of money as a speculator. You got to figure out what the crowd is missing. And then you got to get to where the crowd is going to ultimately be before they arrive. I know eventually the markets are going to figure out what I know. They're going to come to terms with the reality of higher inflation. It's going to be reflected in the bond market. It's going to be reflected in the gold market, the dollar, and it's ultimately going to show up in the price of mining stocks. So the crowd is going to figure this out eventually. And when they do, it's going to be a stampede, right? And they're all going to be, running into one another, bidding up these prices. There aren't a lot of mining stocks out there. Even if you added up all the market caps of the whole sector, you don't even get one decent S&P 500 company. I forget the combined market cap of all the gold stocks, but it's very small. And even if the institutions that are out there, the pension funds, the endowments, the hedge funds, if they just want 5% allocation to this sector, it's a game changer. Probably even 2%, 1% would be huge, because right now it's practically zero. So there's really no interest, even though there should be tremendous interest, because again, we still have faith in the Fed. People still believe Jerome Powell. They believe, everybody else on the FOMC. When they say they're going to bring inflation down to 2%, they believe them. They still don't get that they're going to say that regardless of what they're actually capable of doing. But the other way that Powell is not serious about bringing inflation down to 2% is that he's saying nothing about the budget deficits. He's not telling Congress to cut government spending, because there's no way that inflation is coming down to 2% unless that happens. And Powell's got to know that. His job is impossible with $2 trillion budget deficits and $1 trillion trade deficits. There's no way. Inflation rates are headed much higher unless we have massive cuts in government spending. And that's not going to happen. And it's especially not going to happen if you have a weak Fed chairman like Jerome Powell, who is afraid to speak up and tell Congress what they need to do and what they need to hear, and that they've got to reduce spending significantly. They're still spending, like it's COVID. We had this huge increase in government spending during COVID. And while it's come down quite a bit from the extreme levels that we got to, they didn't return to the levels pre-COVID. And they were extreme too. We were spending too much before COVID. Now we're even spending that much more.
Your tax evasion, let alone the fact that the bank helped, right? Which of course we didn't do. So it's completely comes up empty. But I've been destroyed by the media, by the accusations. The bank is gone. And in fact, why was the bank not sold? In the cease and desist letter, the only reason that the Puerto Rican regulators gave for now not allowing me to sell my bank, which I had it sold for $25 million in stock and cash, was because of the stock component. They said, you can't sell this bank because you're still going to own 4.5% of the parent company, and we can't allow that because of all the bad publicity about you. We don't want you owning 4.5% of a bank. Well, if they don't want me owning 4.5% of a bank, they clearly don't want me owning 100% of the bank, which is what I own, which is why the bank was shut down, which is why it was put into receivership despite not being insolvent. Again, the article in the Daily Wire points out that the pretense under which my bank was closed was that it was insolvent, that it was critically insolvent. But it wasn't. There were millions of dollars more than was owed to the depositors. And we had no debt. We had no past due bills. The receiver, the incompetent receiver that was put in charge, at least he was able to confirm that. At least he saw that we didn't need him because we didn't have any debt. We weren't insolvent. So, but they had to come up with a pretense. They couldn't legally say we're closing the bank because of bad publicity, but they let the cat out of the bag in that cease and desist because that was the only reason they gave for turning down the sale. They didn't give that reason for shutting down the bank, but they gave that reason for turning down the sale. Because when you're trying to sell a bank to somebody else, the new buyers have to be vetted and they have to be, clean, on the up and up, right? Your reputation is important. They don't want to allow somebody with a bad reputation to buy a bank. So they didn't let Quinta buy my bank because I was one of the owners and I had a bad reputation. But I already owned the bank. I already owned 100% of the bank. So why can't they let me reduce my ownership down to 4%? They wouldn't. But they point out this whole thing is a farce because the government got me anyway. And so if this is allowed, right, if the government gets away with this, then they can take down anybody they want. You see, it's very easy to accuse somebody of something when you have no evidence. You just make an accusation, start an investigation, Then you leak the fact that there's an investigation to your partners in the media. Then they go out and claim you're guilty. And then that's it. You win. You don't have to do anything. You don't have to prove anything. You can destroy somebody based on an allegation. That is why a grand jury investigation is supposed to be kept secret, to protect me and everybody else who is investigated for a crime, because you can't be tainted by an investigation, because a lot of investigations find nothing, right? You don't want let's say you're going to get investigated for child abuse or rape. Do you want those investigations to be out there? No, because people are going to assume that you're guilty. Even if you never get charged, maybe they'll just think, they couldn't find enough evidence, so he's probably guilty anyway. He got lucky. He got a good lawyer. And the thing is, they come out with the news that you're being investigated, and maybe that story is blanketed all over the world. But the fact that you're never charged, that's not a story. Think about, or look at all of the newspapers around the world, all the internet stories that were about this investigation. There hasn't been a single story other than the Daily Wire that says that the investigation came up empty. Nobody knows but people who read this article that I'm innocent. All they know is that I was probably guilty because they read all these stories. It's not like 60 Minutes Australia or even the New York Times, right? I mean, I sued 60 Minutes Australia, right? So they're pissed at me because I sued them. But I'm the one that should be pissed at them because they lied about me. But I didn't sue the New York Times because I thought that the New York Times could say they relied in good faith on 60 Minutes, right? That they thought what they were saying was true because, the 60 Minutes broadcast came first. The Age article came first. And so they used that as their source. Well, they've never admitted, the New York Times, the reporter, Matthew Goldstein, who wrote that article in the New York Times about this massive investigation of me and about the 60 Minutes interview that I walked out on, he has yet to run a report telling New York Times readers, by the way, you remember that massive Operation Atlantis, that unprecedented investigation for money laundering and tax evasion that we said was investigating Europe Pacific Bank and Peter Schiff? Well, you know what? It came up empty. It turns out the bank wasn't helping anybody launder money or evade taxes. Oh, well, it went out of business anyway. All the bad press, because we ran the article. If the New York Times had any sense of dignity, any professionalism, any integrity, they wouldn't have run the story. Even if you get the information, if you know it's been illegally leaked, you don't use it. You don't exploit it. That is the problem. They probably wouldn't have done it, but for my politics, right? They may have done me the courtesy of keeping the information private and waiting for an actual indictment, waiting for actual charges. But that's what the IRS agent, he had no legal authority to travel to Puerto Rico and to hold a press conference to talk about an investigation that resulted in no charges. That was another crime committed by the number one cop at the IRS. The guy in charge of prosecuting other people is himself a criminal. He needs to be prosecuted. We need to have a widespread movement out there to get to the bottom of this, right? This article by the Daily Wire, it's not just me saying this. This is an independent reporter who wrote this. He contacted the IRS. He asked them a bunch of questions. They refused to answer any of his questions. He contacted OSIF in Puerto Rico. They refused to answer a single question. Contacted the receiver of the bank, refused to answer a single question. You have these government people that are refusing to talk to a reporter. Now, why? If they could justify their actions, they would do it. They know he's writing a story. They don't want to comment on it. Why? Because they know that what they did was illegal. And so there's nothing they can say. So they're just going to keep quiet and hope nobody notices. Well, I want people to notice. In fact, I tweeted at Elon Musk today because, the guy's got the article up on Twitter. And I'm hoping that maybe Elon Musk will retweet it or make a comment on it. I mean, I think we got to do whatever we can to, you find this tweet on, the one that I retweeted and tagged Elon Musk. I think it's got about maybe 4,000 or 5,000 likes, maybe 1,000 retweets. It needs to have a lot more. We need to get this issue front and center. There are a lot of people that say, Peter, why do you keep talking about this? Nobody really cares. This isn't important. This is very important. Again, it's not just about me. Sure, I'm pissed off at what happened to me. I'm pissed off about the money I lost. I'm pissed off that I have thousands of customers that haven't had any access to their money in over a year. Why? The money's been there the entire time. It's just bogged down in all this government bureaucracy. All the money was there. This is unnecessary suffering on the part of innocent people. But it's beyond that. This is about every American's individual liberty and freedom, because we have no freedoms. If the government is this powerful, if it has no checks on what it can do, if it can destroy political enemies the way it's doing it, then we have no freedom left. We're like a banana republic in the United States. I mean, we're out there now, we're trying to help the Ukrainians, right? Fight off the Russians. This is much bigger than that. What about protecting Americans from their own government? This is where we should be concerned. Sure, we want the Ukrainians to be free, but we need Americans to be free first, right? Let's take care of our own country first. Let's restore freedom and liberty in America before we start worrying about what's happening in the Ukraine. This is much bigger. There's 300 million of us, right? And so we need to do something. Congress needs to check the executive branch. The courts need to check the executive branch. This is not King Obama, right? He doesn't have the ability. They like to talk about, Putin's a dictator. Well, what about Obama? The U.S. government is acting like dictators, right? When they're doing this stuff. So we need to bring attention to it. Twitter may be one of the last bastions of free speech left. So maybe we could, help get a groundswell on Twitter about this. No reporters have contacted me. I talked to the Daily Wire reporter. He had expected that, he would be contacted. Maybe people would want to interview him about the story. No. This story is Pulitzer Prize written material. I think this is a much bigger deal than like Watergate. And, you had the press, right, blow the lid on Watergate. What was really Watergate? Watergate was one group of politicians spying on another group of politicians, right? That's really what was going on. So Woodward and Birdstrings, hey, their whole career is made because they ferret out this break-in of politicians. This is much worse, right? Because it's important constitutional rights. My right of not to be deprived of property without due process. My right of the presumption of innocence, my right of freedom of speech, right? All these rights are being thrown aside. But if the government can do it to me and get away with it, they can do it to anybody. And, and so you got to take a stand. You got to draw a line and put a break on this. And again, this is up at the top of the U.S. government. You can't get much higher than this. And so far, nothing has happened. A lot of people are looking for examples or a way to prove that the IRS targets political adversaries. There was a lot of talk that the IRS was targeting the Tea Party or other conservatives. Maybe they didn't have any proof. Well, you know what? I've got the proof. It's all there. We need a congressional investigation into what happened. The IRS agent needs to be forced to come before Congress. Jim Lee, he needs to answer questions about what happened under oath, about Operation Atlantis, about the J5, about what happened with OSIF, about whether or not he pressured OSIF into turning down the sale to Quinta. All the stuff, this coordinated conspiracy to deprive me of my rights and bring in the media and use the media to spread government propaganda and fake news. All of this has to come under congressional scrutiny and hopefully criminal prosecutions. Not just that Jim Lee should get fired for what he did. He should be charged. Because remember, the IRS charges other people with tax evasion and puts them in jail. Well, if the person who is in charge of that is committing crimes, he's got to go to jail too. We talk about nobody being above the law. People want to say, well, Donald Trump is not above the law, so they trump up these BS charges. Well, neither is the top cop at the IRS. He's not above the law either. He has to obey the law. He has to abide by the Constitution. All these people swear oaths to obey the Constitution. Well, let's hold them accountable, but they also have to follow the rules. It's the government officials that are most need to be held accountable because they have all this. They've got more charges trumped up against Trump for January 6th. Meanwhile, they completely ignore what's going on with Hunter Biden and the big guy. I mean, look at the newest revelation, new documents that were just released, I think, yesterday, just confirming that the Bidens were paid this $10 million bribe, $5 million to Hunter and $5 million to the big guy, Joe Biden, in order to apply political pressure, right, in the Ukraine to help this Ukrainian oil company solve a problem. They were able to pay off the Bidens, and in the documents that were released, they're even referencing the fact that, well, Biden is not really that smart, or Hunter, we got to keep him on the payroll anyway, but we got to find somebody who actually understands something about oil and gas because, these guys don't know anything, but we need to keep them on. And Hunter is going to take care of this problem through his dad. We've got this problem and we have to pay off these guys, but don't worry because, Biden is going to take care of it. I mean, these are serious, serious crimes. And it seems like there's plenty of evidence to at least bring charges. Now, there's probably enough evidence for a conviction, but there's certainly enough evidence to file charges, yet nothing is happening, right? All we're focusing on another indictment for Donald Trump, and we're ignoring the fact that we have a sitting U.S. president that has basically committed acts of treason while he was vice president, and who knows what he's done while he was president. But again, getting back to the particular hearing, it's very obvious from all of the stuff that has come out that the Biden campaign was able to convince social media, Twitter, Facebook, to bury the Hunter Biden story of the laptop by labeling it fake news, by claiming it was some kind of Russian propaganda to influence the election. And so they got social media to bury the story. And it's pretty apparent that had that not happened, had the story been told, had people been allowed to share the story, and it really started with the New York Post, right? But had that story been allowed to organically grow, had there been appropriate media coverage of what was revealed in the Hunter Biden laptop, it's very likely that the results of the 2020 election would have been different, that Donald Trump would have been reelected had the media fairly covered the election. So everybody wants to talk about the fact that, Trump was talking about the election was rigged, the election was unfair. Forget about all that, whether the votes were rigged or not. It was rigged in the media. It was rigged by a collusion between the Biden camp and the media to deceive the voters, to not allowing the voters to hear a story that would have been detrimental to the Biden campaign. That is the real story, I think, of the 2020 election. Forget about what might happen at the polls, right? It was that effort because the election, I mean, it swung on a few states, right? But 4 or 5 states that could have gone either way, right? That's how Trump won. The states that he won could have gone the other way. They were pretty close. And then he lost those, states. But had the news been allowed to spread, it's very likely that Trump would have won. So he obviously had a right to be pissed off about the coverage and about having been falsely accused. But now they're trying to accuse him again of another crime because he is protesting the election. And again, just like with freedom of speech, you've got to be able to protest an election. I mean, you can't say that if you believe an election wasn't fair, that you can't say anything about it. You have to be able to say something. In fact, elections have been contested ever since we've had an election. How many people demand a recount, right? And they, it happens all the time that people contest elections. Elections have to be contested because if I'm holding an election and I know that it's beyond contesting, well, then why not cheat? Why not rig it? If I never have to worry about being challenged, if it's somehow illegal to question the results, well, then how do you know the elections are fair? You have to have some accountability. You have to be able to withstand a challenge. And, can people protest? Right? People keep talking about, January 6th, people went down, they protested. So what? They protested. They keep wanting to call what happened on January 6th insurrection, as if they actually went down there to overthrow the government. How are you going to overthrow the government without any weapons? When all you have is cell phones and you're taking selfies? What kind of insurrection is that? And of course, they get down there and the Capitol Hill police are escorting these people into the Capitol building, opening up locked doors. Here you go. I mean, nobody thought they were doing anything wrong, at least the majority of people. But this has all been spun by the media. The same way they went after me. I talked about this again on my last podcast. The government wanted to pretend that I was using my bank to help criminals launder money and evade taxes. And how did they do that? They got the media to do their dirty work. The media went out and told the government's lie for the government. The government wasn't able to tell the lie themselves. They had the media do it. Although then, to protect the media, because, I sued for defamation, they went out and told the lie themselves when they had the press conference down in Puerto Rico. But more proof, again, that the media is colluding with the government is that, sure, the New York Times was willing to report that I was under investigation for money laundering and tax evasion. They were willing to write that story. The story that they refused to write is that the investigation found nothing, that it turns out that I wasn't guilty of money laundering and tax evasion. They don't want to write that story. As far as they're concerned, there is no story anymore. Now, of course, if I was indicted, well, it would have been all over the New York Times, right? They would have wrote that story. But the fact that they didn't find any evidence to even charge me with a crime, the story is over. And of course, they were willing to write the story about 60 Minutes and about me walking out on the interview. Oh, Peter Schiff walks out on this 60 Minutes interview as if I had something to hide. But when I sue 60 Minutes for defamation and I win, they don't want to write that story. The New York Times didn't get sued. I didn't sue the Times. And 60 Minutes Australia actually used that against me. They tried to say that I should have sued the Times. And because I didn't sue the Times, that they shouldn't be liable, which was BS. But there were reasons I didn't sue the Times. One was because the 60 Minutes stuff came out first. And had I sued the Times could have said, well, we were just relying on 60 Minutes. We relied on these other stories, and therefore we had a reasonable basis for what we said. And I thought that they could have used that. Also, it's harder to win a defamation lawsuit in the U.S. when you're a public person because you have to prove malice. So not only would I have to prove that the statements were false, which I could have easily done, but I would have to prove that 60 Minutes was malicious or the New York Times was malicious in their reporting. But given the fact that they could say, well, we were just using 60 Minutes as a source, I didn't think I could prove malice. And that was the advice I got from counsel. So I didn't sue them, right? But you would think, hey, I didn't sue you guys. You can at least set the record straight. You could at least say, hey, remember we wrote this article about Europe Pacific Bank and Peter Schiff, and they were under investigation. Turns out they didn't do anything wrong. But the bigger story, the one that they refused to write, is the fact that their reporting of the investigation destroyed the bank, even though it was completely innocent. Even though we didn't do anything wrong, the bank is gone. Why? Because the media killed it by prematurely reporting guilt or just reporting the investigation. Because once you report that somebody's being investigated, well, they might as well be guilty. After all, why else would they be investigated? But this is what they did with the Hunter Biden. This is what they're doing now with Trump, what they're doing with Robert Kennedy Jr. The media is crafting a narrative. and they're working with the government to push this political agenda. All of this is obvious that this is going on, and it is very frustrating to actually be dealing with it personally, but watching the whole thing transpire. There has got to be a big backlash. That's one of the reasons that I'm hoping that I can get some type of congressional investigation of the circumstances surrounding what happened to me, because I think all this is important, because I think there's enough information here that, and especially if a congressional hearing can get a lot of these documents that I'm not able to get, that the government is able to hide, to actually show how this is working, how the government conspires with the media to deceive the public. Because if I can show it with me, then you could show it on a much broader spectrum. But this is exactly what's going on. So that's why these hearings, and if you haven't watched it, it's, I don't know, a couple of hours, but it's worth watching. And it's interesting too, that the Democrats, to watch them, how they're attacking Robert Kennedy, and then to see the Republicans have to come to his defense. I can understand the political strategy there, but it's the irony, I think, that is most important, rather than the politics. And the fact that you do have to have some Republicans that are still standing up for freedom of speech. It used to be something that the Democrats at least claim to care about. They don't care about it at all anymore. The only speech that they want to protect is speech that they agree with. And they want to completely censor anybody who says anything with which they disagree or they find offensive. Well, that to me is extremely offensive as an American, as a libertarian. Everybody should be offended by what is currently happening. Anyway, that's it for today's podcast. I will be back home, or not home. Home is Puerto Rico. I'm not going to be back in Puerto Rico probably until about the 10th of August, which is actually coming up. So it's not that far away, but I will be back in Connecticut for the next live episode of the Peter Schiff Show podcast. An uncertain housing expenses, when the real way to avoid uncertain expenses is to rent. That's the only way to make sure that you have some type of predictable cost. And as I mentioned, it's easy to get out of a lease. Your lease is up, you move on. Not so easy to get out of a home. You own a home, you got to sell it. You got to find a buyer. And as I said, right now, there's not that many buyers out there. So you could be stuck, right? You might have a job offer in another town or another state, and you may have to reject that because you're stuck in your house and you can't sell it. But if you're renting, yeah, it's very easy to take a better job offer because you just don't renew your rent. You just leave. And even if you leave a few months early, you have to, pay a little penalty to break your lease. It's no big deal. Nothing compared to what happens when you own a home and you are stuck with that home. So it's all these realtors and mortgage bankers that are overselling the concept of home ownership. It makes sense for some people in certain circumstances, but for a lot of other people, the best thing they can do is rent. But I want to move forward and talk a little bit more about politics, because I was watching this evening, right? Even after, I'm home from dinner, and I'm watching on YouTube the hearings that we had today in the House. And this is on censorship in social media. And one of the witnesses was Robert Kennedy Jr. And to see the way he is being attacked, not by the Republicans, right, but by members of his own party, the Democrats. In fact, in particular, I think the worst one was this Deborah Wasserman Schultz, who is from Florida. And a big part of the current attack on Robert Kennedy Jr. And again, I have very different political views. Kennedy is a typical Kennedy. I mean, he believes in the social welfare state, big government, a Democrat. And so I'm a free market libertarian. So we really are at odds with one another with that respect. But where we have some strong common ground is freedom of speech, freedom of expression. And we both know that the most important speech that needs protection is political speech, in particular, speech that is critical of the government. That's when free speech is the most important. Your freedom to criticize the government. And also, free speech is about protecting unpopular speech. Because popular speech, that doesn't need any protection. If you're just going to say something that everybody likes, well, fine, you can say it. Where you need protection is when you want to say something that a lot of people don't like, right? There is an old expression, I may disagree with what you say, but I will defend your right to say it. Today, it's the opposite. I disagree with what you're saying, and you have no right to say it, right? That's what the left is now all about. In fact, on the panel, somebody pointed out, and then Robert Kennedy Jr. reiterated, because one of the women that was up there was from the American Civil Liberties Union. And I disagreed with a lot of what they did, but at least they were on the right page when it came to freedom of speech. I mean, they would defend the right of a Nazi to free speech. And you have to do that. You have to defend speech that you don't like, because if you're not willing to defend speech that you don't like, then you don't believe in freedom of speech. And eventually it's your speech that's not going to be allowed. But again, the most important speech that needs to be uninhibited is when you're critical of the government. So when the government says something or does something, you have to be able to criticize it. And what's been going on with social media was the coordinated effort on the part of government and social media to suppress speech that contradicted the government or a government narrative. And that's precisely the type of speech that needs to be protected the most. Even if the government is right, even if what the government is saying is right, you have to be able to criticize the government. Because if you can't criticize the government when they're right, well, then you definitely won't be able to criticize them when they're wrong. And if the government knows that they can't be criticized, then that opens the government up. They have a lot more opportunity to be oppressive if they don't think there's any way to speak out against it. So you always have to be able to question the government. You can't say, well, it's so important. This piece of information, like when it comes to COVID, it's so important that nobody should be able to criticize the government during this important time. You cannot give up that principle just because it's convenient. And Robert Kennedy Jr. was doing a good job of making that point. But this Deborah Wasserman Schultz, if you go and you can watch this on YouTube. So she is basically quoting Kennedy out of context, right? There's all this footage of him. He's, having dinner. He's speaking with some people, and he's talking about actual studies that showed that COVID genetically, that Ashkenazic Jews and I think Chinese, for whatever reason, statistically, were less susceptible to COVID than, let's say, whites or African Americans, whatever it was. But he wasn't making a point that he personally believed that the COVID virus was designed intentionally to spare those groups. That was not the point he was trying to make. But if you took part of his conversation out of context, you could make it appear that that's the point he was trying to make. Because you can always take somebody out of context and not let people see the totality of what was being said. You can pull out something, which has been done to me on many occasions, with 60 Minutes or The Daily Show. You could make anybody look bad if you just take some words, but you don't show the proper context with which those words were spoken. So that's what they're doing with Kennedy. So Deborah Wasserman Schultz is basically putting all these words into Kennedy's mouth. He's sitting there, right, trying to set the record straight. Excuse me, but that's not what I said. Let me tell you what I said. And she won't let him talk. In fact, she'll ask him a question and then interrupt him if he tries to answer it and say, I want my time back. I mean, she doesn't want him to set the record straight. She wants to distort the record. And that's what every single Democrat is doing. Why do they want to vilify this man so much? Why do they want to turn him into some kind of racist, anti-Semite? I mean, there's probably nothing about this man that is racist or anti-Semite. I mean, again, I disagree with a lot of his politics, but I think he's sincere. I think he's an honest guy. I don't think he's in any way a racist or, however they want to portray him, but they want to label him this because they want to protect Joe Biden, right? Because he is running against their guy. And so therefore he's now the enemy because he is against the establishment. And he is calling out a lot of the problems in the Democratic Party. He's pointing out that the Democratic Party has changed. And it's not the Democratic Party that he grew up with, where his father and his uncle were the standard bearers. And I agree. The Democratic Party is even worse. Not that I was a big fan of that Democratic Party. I didn't like them either. But the one we got now is even worse. And the problem is that Kennedy is calling out the Democrats from the Democratic Party. And so they all have to coalesce and agree to vilify him and try to turn him into this, anti-Semitic, homophobe, whatever it is, in order to discredit all the legitimate things that he has to say. And, one of the other interesting things about this hearing, and first of all, the ironic part about it, I think it was pointed out, is that the hearing was about censorship. And the Democrats actually wanted to censor Kennedy as a witness. They didn't even want to let him talk. They said he was too racist and anti-Semitic to be allowed to testify, that he should be silenced simply because of his anti-Semitism, which was completely manufactured by the Democrats who are trying to suppress his right to speak. But the other issue that they were looking at was the Hunter Biden with the laptop. And by the way, since my last podcast, right, Donald Trump again came out and revealed that he's probably going to get indicted again for a third time regarding January 6th. And I don't really know, what the charges are going to be, but apparently fiscal policy, the mistakes that they are making with fiscal policy. So I wish one of these congressmen or senators would ask Chair Powell, Mr. Powell, you claim that you don't have the right to comment on fiscal policy, let alone, he definitely won't criticize it, but he claims he can't even comment on it. He can't even talk about it like, theoretically, like it's sacrosanct, right? When was there a law passed that did this? When were these handcuffs put on the Fed? Because they clearly weren't on Volcker. They weren't on Greenspan. Now, I didn't do much research into Yellen or Bernanke. I doubt they were big critics of the fiscal policy of the government, but not because they couldn't, maybe because they didn't want to, maybe because they didn't care. But now, when you have a Fed chairman being asked by so many congressional representatives, give us your opinion. We want to know what you think of these deficits. And he says, I can't tell you. I'm not allowed. Based on what law? Because if Volcker was allowed, if Greenspan was allowed, and if Congress hasn't passed any legislation that would somehow inhibit the Fed from commenting on fiscal policy, then why can't he do it?
The reason is he's copping out. He doesn't want to comment because he doesn't want to put these politicians in the spot and call them out. But that's exactly what he needs to do. And the fact that he won't do it, that is more proof that we don't have an independent central bank. He's trying to claim, oh, the central bank is independent, so we won't criticize Congress. No. If the central bank was independent, they would be criticizing Congress. The fact that they're not criticizing it proves that there's no independence. Anyway, also, Powell commented too. He tried to say that, look, there is no real link between the big balance sheet, all the QE, and inflation, because we were doing QE for a long time and we had really low inflation. Yes, because the government lied about it, the way they measured it, but there is a big lag. Yes, there was a long period of time between the creating of the inflation and the effect that inflation had on prices. As I said many, many times, the Fed got lulled into a false sense of complacency in that it created inflation for so long without any seemingly adverse consequences, because the official measures of inflation were still below 2%. And so that gave them a false sense of confidence that they could keep on creating inflation by printing money and that prices wouldn't go up. Well, now all of a sudden it hit them like a brick, and now we're dealing with years and years of inflation chickens that have come home to roost, and Powell is still not recognizing the connection there. Now, I'm going to move forward to the Senate. And the opening remarks, and here the Democrats are in charge. So you got the chairman of the Senate Banking Committee is Senator Sherrod Brown. And the first thing he did was he thanked Powell for bringing down inflation. And he said that it is great now that Americans are enjoying falling prices. I'm not making this up. He said falling prices. And prices aren't falling. I don't know what this guy's talking about. I mean, some prices have fallen, right? Gas prices have come down from the highs where they were. But the CPI isn't falling. It's still going up. It's just going up at a slower rate. That's probably what he meant, but that's not what he said. In fact, he wasn't just speaking off the cuff. He was reading, prepared remarks. And so either he wrote them or somebody else wrote them, and they were able to think about them. But he said that that Americans are now benefiting from falling prices. They're not. Prices are still rising, so they're still suffering. The prices that were too high last year are even higher this year because prices continue to go up. Even if they have reduced the rate of increase, they're still increasing at a rate that's too high, and that's just temporary. Now, another thing that Powell did was he assured the Senate that the banking system is sound. It's not sound at all. He said it was sound and resilient. Yes, we're having a problem with the air conditioning in this house. I didn't realize it. I'm down here in the basement and it's not on. That's why I keep brushing the sweat off my brow. I didn't even realize it was this hot down here. We got to get somebody, some of the ACs are working in the house and some of them just all of a sudden stop. I forgot that it's not working down here. So I'm getting pretty hot. But he assured the U.S. Senate that the banking system was sound and resilient. It's anything but. I mean, if it wasn't for the government propping the banks up right now, that we would already had a complete implosion. I mean, we've already had some of the biggest bank failures in history, this year. And if it wasn't for the government coming to the rescue, there would have been more. Now, of course, if it wasn't for the government, they wouldn't be so insolvent. There was another, actually, I'm going to get to that last because I think that's my last tweet. Excuse me, no, I'm still dealing with this cough. So one of the senators asked Powell about the losses on the Fed's balance sheet because he correctly pointed out, the problem with Silicon Valley Bank or Signature Bank, these other banks, is that the value of their treasuries went down, right? The value of their mortgage-backed securities went down, and so that's why they were insolvent. And he said, what about the Fed? The Fed's got the biggest balance sheet of all, and the Fed has massive losses too on its bonds. And so he said, what about that? And Powell basically shrugged it off and said, well, it's just a paper loss.